Madeline Carter never thought that one day she would have to ask herself whether the man lying beside her every night was secretly poisoning her. But this morning, as Ethan, her husband, placed a steaming cup of coffee in front of her with a faint smile, a cold shiver ran down her spine. "You love coffee, don't you? I made this one just for you," Ethan said gently, his voice soft but hollow, his eyes betraying something unsettling. Madeline sat in the grand dining room of Sophia Mitchell, her sister-in-law, a woman who always appeared considerate but exuded an insincere charm that put her on edge. Everything in this room was meticulously arranged, from the gleaming silverware to the warm golden lighting reflecting off the oak dining table. But perfection was only an illusion. Everything here, from the tea last month that sent her to the emergency room to the meals that mysteriously made her sick, carried an underlying deceit. She lifted the coffee cup, and a strong metallic scent wafted up, hitting her nostrils like a warning bell. A wave of nausea rose in her throat, not from the coffee itself, but from the fear solidifying inside her. She had once dismissed the previous incidents as coincidences, but not anymore. This wasn't an accident. This was a plan. Across the table, Sophia absent-mindedly stirred her own untouched coffee. A smirk flickered across her lips as she watched Madeline, a look of expectation, almost anticipation. "Ethan has been quite the barista lately," Sophia remarked, her tone casual but her words laced with something deeper. "He's been experimenting with different brewing methods. Just for you." That phrase, "for you," sent ice down Madeline's spine. What exactly was meant for her? Another trip to the hospital? Or this time something more final? Madeline forced herself to smile, placing the cup gently back on the table, her eyes never leaving the two people across from her. The puzzle pieces were falling into place. Ethan and Sophia's secret meetings, the hushed conversations that stopped the moment she walked into the room, the glimpses of strange texts on Ethan's phone. And now, this cup of coffee with its unsettling aroma. She had felt something was off from the very beginning of her marriage. The early signs: spilled wine on her designer dress at an important gala, food that always tasted slightly different from everyone else's, Sophia's condescending remarks about how Madeline must have a sensitive stomach. But now there was no more doubt. This wasn't pettiness. This wasn't jealousy. This was deliberate. She thought back to the last time she had ended up in the hospital after drinking tea at Sophia's house. The doctors had found nothing conclusive, just vague symptoms of poisoning with no clear cause. The dizziness, the weakness, the stomach cramps that had left her doubled over in pain. And just like now, Sophia hadn't touched her own drink. Madeline took a slow breath. If this was truly a plan, she couldn't fall for it again. She needed a way to confirm her suspicions. And she had only one chance. "Oh no, I completely forgot. I have an important work call," she said suddenly, reaching for her phone. "Sophia, would you mind if I use your study for a few minutes?" "Of course," Sophia replied, her voice sweet but her gaze sharp. "Just try not to break anything." Madeline stood, bracing herself against the table for balance. In that brief moment, she deliberately stumbled, causing her coffee cup to tilt. As she reached out to steady herself, she swiftly swapped her cup with Sophia's, an imperceptible motion executed in less than a second. "Oh gosh, I'm so clumsy," she laughed, straightening up. "Good thing I didn't spill anything." Sophia merely waved it off with a tight-lipped smile. She hadn't noticed. Madeline walked toward the study, but instead of making a call, she stood behind the door, her heart hammering as she peered through the small gap. And then she saw it. Sophia lifted the coffee cup to her lips and took a sip. The moment felt like it stretched into eternity. First, nothing happened. Then, within seconds, her body tensed. Her hand trembled slightly, the cup clinking against the table in an eerie rhythmic tap. A bead of sweat formed at her temple, her complexion turning a sickly pale. "Ethan," her voice quivered. "Something's not right." Ethan turned to her, his expression shifting from indifference to sheer panic. "Shit, Sophia. You weren't supposed to." He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening in horror as the realization hit him. Madeline didn't need to see more. She pulled out her phone and pressed record. She had been right. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't coincidence. Ethan and Sophia had been poisoning her. But today, their plan had backfired spectacularly. Now, all she had to do was wait and see how it all unfolded. And this time she held all the evidence. Madeline Carter stood behind the office door, her heart pounding as she peeked through the small gap. Just moments ago, Sophia Mitchell had taken a sip from the coffee cup that was supposed to be hers. The tension in the air thickened as Sophia's hands trembled, the cup in her grip clinking against the table in a rhythmic, unsettling tap. "Ethan." Sophia's voice wavered, almost a whisper. Something is wrong." Madeline felt a chill run down her spine. She had suspected this for a long time, but watching Sophia succumb to the very poison meant for her confirmed everything. Ethan Carter, her husband, turned sharply toward his sister. At first, he looked merely confused, but when he saw the color drain from Sophia's face, when he noticed the beads of sweat forming at her temple, panic overtook him. "Shit, Sophia." His voice cracked, eyes wide with fear. "You weren't supposed to." He stopped himself mid-sentence. Madeline took a deep breath and stepped out of the office, her phone steady in her hand, recording every second. This moment was crucial. This was no longer a game of suspicion. This was irrefutable proof. "What's the matter?" she asked, her voice calm yet sharp as a knife. "Wasn't that my coffee?" Ethan flinched as if struck. Sophia barely managed to keep herself upright, gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her from collapsing. You switched the cups." Sophia's voice was filled with both fury and terror. Madeline tilted her head slightly, a small, humorless smile forming on her lips. "And you're saying that as if I shouldn't have." She let the words sink in before continuing, her gaze unwavering. "But the real question is, why did I have to?" Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room, broken only by Sophia's labored breathing and the distant hum of traffic outside. Madeline slowly raised her phone, the screen still recording. "What did you mean just now, Ethan? You weren't supposed to. What exactly weren't you expecting?" "Madeline, it's not what you think," Ethan stammered, but his eyes betrayed him. Madeline let out a soft, disbelieving laugh. The anger she had been holding back for months bubbled to the surface. How many times had she been poisoned? How many nights had she spent curled up in agony while these two stood by, feigning concern? How many lies had they fed her, telling her she was just sensitive, that it must have been something she ate earlier? Not this time. She turned back to her phone, pressing the dial button. 911, what's your emergency? "I need medical assistance at 1542 Maple Grove Drive," she said, her voice cold and steady. "A woman is showing signs of severe poisoning after drinking coffee that may have been intentionally tampered with. She is conscious but deteriorating quickly." Sophia let out a strained gasp, her body convulsing slightly as she tried to steady herself. "You don't understand, Madeline," she hissed. "No, I think I do," Madeline replied. "You just never expected me to outsmart you." Sophia was visibly shaking now. "Ethan Cole, an ambulance." But Ethan stood frozen, his face twisted in realization. He wasn't just losing control of the situation. He was losing everything. Sirens pierced the tense silence, growing louder as the ambulance approached. As paramedics rushed inside, Madeline stepped aside, watching them lift Sophia onto a stretcher. She turned to look at her husband. No, not her husband. Ethan was nothing more than a traitor now. Liar. A man who had plotted to poison the woman he had vowed to love. She moved closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "I have everything I need," she whispered. "And this time I'm not the victim." Ethan swallowed hard but didn't reply. He knew it was over. Minutes later the police arrived. As an officer approached Madeline, she calmly handed over her phone. "I have video evidence," she said. "And there's more, text messages, recordings. I've been collecting proof for months. Sophia, now on the stretcher, caught Madeline's gaze. This time there was no triumph in her eyes, only raw, undeniable fear. Then came Ethan's turn. Two officers stepped forward, grabbing his arms. "Ethan Carter, you are under arrest on suspicion of attempted poisoning and conspiracy." "Wait." Ethan struggled against their grip. "Madeline, please. This doesn't have to go this far." Madeline stared at him for a long moment, then shook her head. "You had every opportunity to talk to me, Ethan," she said. "But instead you tried to poison me." As they hauled him away, she took a deep breath. She knew this was just the beginning of a long legal battle. But this time she had the upper hand. For the first time in a long time, she was the one in control. Madeline Carter sat in the interrogation room, the cold white light casting sharp shadows on the metal table in front of her. She gripped her phone tightly, the screen still displaying the video she had recorded earlier that morning. The blaring sirens of the ambulance and police cars still echoed in her mind, along with the images of Ethan and Sophia being taken away, their faces twisted in fear. The door creaked open, and Detective Harper entered, carrying a file folder. She was a middle-aged woman with the sharp, knowing eyes of someone who had seen too many cases of betrayal. But when she looked at Madeline, there was a trace of something else. Understanding. "Ms. Carter," Harper said, setting the folder on the table. "I've reviewed your video. This is very serious." Madeline nodded, her voice steadier than she expected. "I know. And I have more than just that." She unlocked her phone and scrolled through folders filled with voice recordings, text messages, and documents. She had started collecting evidence months ago, after the first unexplained illness left her bedridden. "I've been poisoned 3 times in the past 6 months," she began, pulling up a detailed file. "Each time, it happened right after I ate or drank something given to me by Ethan or Sophia." Detective Harper leaned in. "Do you have medical records?" Madeline nodded and opened another folder. "I kept everything: hospital reports, prescriptions, and doctor's notes. The last time was after drinking tea at Sophia's house. The doctors couldn't identify the toxin, but my symptoms match exactly what happened this morning." Harper studied the documents carefully before nodding. "You were very thorough." "I had to be," Madeline replied, her voice cold. "I couldn't trust anyone." A sharp knock on the door interrupted them. A uniformed officer stepped in, handing Harper a file. "Preliminary toxicology report from the hospital on Sophia Mitchell," he announced. Harper flipped through the pages, her expression hardening. She looked up at Madeline, her voice dropping to a grave tone. "Ms. Carter," she said, "the hospital found traces of a chemical compound in Sophia's system. It's not something that should ever be in food or drink. It's only available in specialized laboratories." Madeline clenched her fists. "So they really were trying to kill me?" Harper nodded. "And that means this is no longer just poisoning, it's premeditated attempted murder." Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. Meanwhile, across the police station, Ethan Carter sat in an interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the metal table. He stared at the one-way mirror in front of him, knowing full well that officers were watching him from the other side. The door opened, and Harper walked in, carrying her folder and a recording device. "Ethan Carter," she said, her tone firm. "Do you have anything to say about the allegations against you?" Ethan swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice calm. "I don't know what's going on." Harper raised an eyebrow. "Is that so? Then maybe you'd like to hear some of the evidence we've gathered." She pressed a button on the recorder, and Sophia's voice filled the room, weak but clear. "Ethan, you said it would just make her sick. You promised nothing serious would happen. But you increased the dose. What did you do?" Ethan's face drained of color. Harper watched him closely. "Sophia is talking, Ethan. She's telling us everything. Where you got the chemicals, who helped you, and exactly why you wanted your wife out of the way." Ethan's lips parted, but he struggled to form words. I just wanted Madeline to take a break. She was overworking herself, and Sophia thought that if she got sick for a little while, she'd miss a few projects. "So you poisoned her?" Harper cut in, her voice sharp with disgust. "Do you hear how insane that sounds?" Ethan opened his mouth but had no defense. Harper leaned in, her tone cold. "Listen to me, Ethan. If you cooperate now, the court may show some leniency. But if you continue denying the facts, your sentence will be much worse." Ethan clenched his fists, sweat forming on his brow. Meanwhile, Madeline stepped out of the interrogation room, her breath heavy. She had just finished giving her full statement, providing every piece of evidence she had collected. As she walked down the hallway, her eyes fell on the glass window of the holding cells. There inside sat Ethan, his head in his hands, looking like a man whose world had just collapsed. Madeline took a deep breath. "I loved you," she murmured, though he couldn't hear her. "But you destroyed everything." She turned away without another glance. At the front desk, Harper approached her. "You did everything right," she said. "We'll start the prosecution process immediately." Madeline nodded, but she didn't feel relief. She knew this was only the beginning of a long legal battle. But this time she wasn't afraid. Because this time she had the truth on her side. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as people filed into their seats. The air was thick with anticipation, tension palpable in every breath. The trial of Ethan Carter and Sophia Mitchell versus. The state had drawn significant attention, not only because of the shocking details of the attempted poisoning but also because of the scandal it had created in the corporate world. Madeline Carter sat at the prosecution's table, her fingers intertwined tightly in her lap. She had spent months preparing for this moment, yet nothing could have truly braced her for the sight before her. Ethan, the man she had once trusted with her life, sitting shackled beside his equally disgraced sister Sophia. They both looked different now. Smaller, defeated. Ethan wouldn't meet her eyes. He kept his gaze on the polished wooden table. His once meticulously groomed appearance now haggard, dark circles forming beneath his eyes. Sophia, on the other hand, sat rigidly, her expression carefully neutral, but Madeline saw the slight tremor in her fingers, the only sign that she was cracking beneath the pressure. The judge entered, the courtroom rising as the gavel struck. The trial had begun. The prosecution wasted no time laying out the evidence. First, they played the recorded conversation from that fateful brunch, the moment when Sophia, writhing on the floor, had unwittingly confessed. "You said it would just make her sick enough to miss the board meeting. You promised it wouldn't be traced." The words hung in the air like a curse. Then came the medical reports, detailing the consistent poisoning attempts Madeline had suffered, each incident aligning perfectly with times she had shared meals or drinks with Ethan and Sophia. And then, the damning text messages, ones that Ethan had thought he had deleted, but Madeline had recovered. "Ethan, we have to be more careful this time. Last time she still showed up to the meeting." "Sophia, then increase the dose. She can't keep bouncing back from this." The jury shifted uncomfortably. A few gasps broke out from the gallery. Even now, hearing it in court, Madeline felt her stomach churn. Every piece of evidence stacked higher, painting a clear picture, a carefully orchestrated plan to eliminate her, disguised as a mere inconvenience. Then came the cross-examinations. Sophia was the first to take the stand. Dressed in a modest, carefully chosen suit, she tried to appear composed, but the cracks in her facade were evident. "Ms. Mitchell," the prosecutor's voice rang clear. "Let's talk about intent. You claim you only wanted to inconvenience Mrs. Carter. Yet, toxicology reports confirm the chemical found in her system on multiple occasions was far beyond a mild dose. Care to explain?" Sophia opened her mouth, then shut it. She knew there was no defense. The prosecutor pressed on. "You and your brother documented her reactions, didn't you? You kept notes on which dosages caused what effects, correct?" Sophia's voice cracked. "I didn't." The prosecutor held up a printed copy of an email Sophia had sent to Ethan. "The first dose wasn't strong enough. She still made it to the Henderson meeting. If she doesn't collapse soon, we'll lose the account. Sophia's breath hitched. The jury exchanged glances. Would you still call that an accident, Ms. Mitchell? Sophia remained silent. The prosecutor turned to the judge. No further questions. Then came Ethan's testimony. He hesitated as he took the stand. For the first time since the trial began, Madeline met his gaze. And for the first time, Ethan looked scared. Mr. Carter, the prosecutor began. Let's be direct. Why did you attempt to poison your wife? Ethan swallowed hard. I didn't try to kill her. I just wanted to slow her down. The prosecutor tilted his head. Slow her down. He turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, does that sound like a reasonable excuse for poisoning someone? Ethan shifted uncomfortably. The prosecutor continued, his tone cutting. Did you or did you not tell your sister that, this time, she won't make it to the presentation? Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his disheveled hair. You what, Mr. Carter? I didn't mean. Did you ever think she could die? Ethan's mouth clamped shut. The prosecutor took a step closer. Answer the question. Ethan's voice dropped to a whisper. Yes. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. It was one thing to know it. It was another to hear it. Ethan had known there was a chance she wouldn't survive, and he did it anyway. It took the jury only 3 hours to decide. The courtroom was silent as the foreman stood. For the charge of attempted murder, we find Ethan Carter guilty. Ethan's shoulders sagged. For the charge of conspiracy to commit harm, we find Sophia Mitchell guilty. Sophia inhaled sharply, her body tensing. The judge's voice rang clear. Given the premeditated nature of these actions, having poisoned the victim on multiple occasions and documenting the effects, I am sentencing both defendants to the maximum penalty allowed under law. The gavel struck. And just like that, it was over. 1 year later, Madeline stood behind the podium, staring at the hundreds of professionals seated before her. She had spent so long dreading the past that she almost forgot what it felt like to look toward the future. The biggest threats to success, she said into the microphone, don't always come from competitors. Sometimes they come from the people closest to you. Silence filled the conference hall. But surviving those challenges makes you stronger. Applause erupted. After the speech, a young woman approached her, eyes bright with admiration. How did you get through it all? Madeline smiled, remembering every moment. The fear, the pain, the betrayal. I focused on what I could control, she said simply. I gathered evidence. I trusted my instincts. And I refused to let fear stop me from moving forward. That evening, she received an email from the Henderson account, renewing their contract for another 3 years. She smiled, knowing how differently things could have turned out. On the news, a small segment ran about Ethan Carter and Sophia Mitchell beginning their lengthy prison sentences. Madeline didn't bother watching. Instead, she closed her laptop and turned toward her next big project. Because the best revenge wasn't about getting even. It was about thriving. The night was quiet, save for the distant hum of the city outside Madeline Carter's apartment. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of wine in her hand, gazing at the skyline. A year ago she had stared at this same view, but back then she had been a different person. Someone who trusted too easily, who ignored the warning signs, who believed that love meant overlooking betrayals. Now she understood things differently. Success wasn't just about talent or ambition. It was about awareness, knowing who you could trust, understanding the lengths people would go to in order to manipulate and control you, and, most importantly, having the courage to walk away from those who didn't truly support you. She had spent months trying to understand how Ethan, a man she had once loved, could conspire against her with Sophia, someone who had pretended to be family. Their betrayal had been calculated, precise. Each attempt to poison her crafted not just to harm her physically but to undermine her reputation, to strip away the credibility she had worked so hard to build. They hadn't just wanted her sick. They had wanted her irrelevant. But they had failed. She took a slow sip of wine, her fingers tightening around the glass. They had underestimated her instincts, her resilience. They had assumed she would continue doubting herself, making excuses for the strange illnesses, ignoring the gnawing feeling in her gut that told her something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. That was the first lesson she had learned, trusting her instincts. How many times had she felt uneasy in Sophia's presence? How often had Ethan's lies felt just a little too rehearsed? How many nights had she spent dismissing her own doubts, convincing herself that she was imagining things? It had almost cost her everything. Her mind drifted to the young woman she had spoken to at the conference earlier that day. Bright-eyed and full of ambition, she had asked, "How did you not let this break you?" Madeline had smiled, remembering all the nights she had spent in hospital beds, the pain, the nausea, the uncertainty. "I did break," she had wanted to say. "But I rebuilt myself." That was the second lesson. Resilience wasn't about never falling. It was about choosing to rise every single time. She had fought back. Not with anger, not with revenge, but with facts. She had documented everything. Recorded conversations. Saved texts. Logged every suspicious incident. Every moment that didn't sit right with her. She had become her own best advocate, preparing herself for the day when the truth would come to light. And when the moment arrived, she had been ready. She set the glass down on the marble countertop, her gaze shifting to the unopened letter on the table. It was from her attorney, a formal statement confirming that Ethan and Sophia's appeals had been denied. They would serve their full sentences. Madeline didn't feel joy. She didn't feel the need to celebrate. She felt free. The truth was, there was no satisfaction in seeing them suffer. She had wasted enough energy on them already. Their downfall wasn't what gave her peace. It was the fact that she had taken back control of her own life. That was the third lesson. The best revenge wasn't about destroying others. It was about thriving despite them. Her success had continued to grow. The Henderson contract, the very account Sophia had tried to sabotage her over, had led to even bigger opportunities. Clients respected her not just for her skills, but for her integrity. She had built a reputation that no one, not Ethan, not Sophia, not anyone, could take away from her. But most importantly, she had learned how to build relationships with the right people. She had spent so much time surrounded by those who secretly wanted her to fail that she had forgotten what true support felt like. The past year had been about more than just healing. It had been about surrounding herself with real allies. People who celebrated her victories, not resented them. People who lifted her up instead of trying to break her down. It was a painful realization, but one that had ultimately changed her life. Not everyone who smiles at you is on your side. She had always believed that loyalty was sacred, that love, once given, should be unconditional. But she had learned that loyalty had to be earned. That love, in its truest form, should never require someone to shrink themselves to be accepted. Ethan and Sophia had taught her that, and she would never make the mistake of forgetting it. The city lights flickered, casting golden reflections onto the polished floors. Her phone vibrated with a new email. Another major client signing on. Another step forward. Another victory. She exhaled, the weight of the past finally lifting. They had tried to silence her. They had tried to erase her. But in the end, they had only made her stronger.